Good morning, everybody. We are here to talk about traumatic brain injury in students this morning. My name is Lisa Kazarik. I am with the Fairbanks North Starborough School District, and I am one of the special education coordinators. I am here with my wonderful co-presenter, Anna Zerfus. She is with Stone Student Group, and she is a parent navigator and mentor coordinator. Excellent person to reach out to if you ever have questions about anything in SPED and you don't want to call your local special education department. So today we will be covering some general information on traumatic brain injury, what the effects for learning can be on children and youth, a look at return to play and academics, how TBI can be related to special education, including accommodations and modifications, and finally, some support strategies for parents and caregivers to assist those affected by TBI.
So I'm going to start off with an example because brain injury looks very similar even in adults. Imagine you get one laptop your entire life, and it is so complex. It is only fully understood by the people who made it. It can do an infinite number of things. It is well protected from viruses. It has a fantastic hard case. But one day you are late to the airport to catch a flight, and you're pulling that precious laptop out as you run up the stairs to security, and it slips. And you watch as it goes crashing down the concrete stairs. Even with all that protection, when you turn it on, you realize that it has been damaged. There are files missing, the camera is flickering, the power is unstable, and things seem to always be in a different place. Tech support can help with some of these issues, but your computer will never be the same. This is how a brain can be affected from a mild or moderate brain injury. So this is the CDC definition, and it is very broad. Any kind of injury that affects the head or neck can result in a brain injury. Now, there is a level of uniqueness to TBI in comparison to other injuries. So like, let's say you break your arm, there are usually symptoms and then a process of healing that is typical. You can see it on x-rays and you can work around it. There is no typical TBI. If you've seen one, you've only seen one. And the healing process is different for each one. Most of all, you cannot work around it. You have to live and work through it, which it can be incredibly difficult. Now, as in all things, there are myths about TBIs. And so we're going to watch a little bit video about those.
Perfect. So when it comes to types of brain injuries, we generally talk about two types and three levels of severity. The two types include a closed or a penetrating head injury, and the levels of severity are mild, moderate, and severe. Something to keep in mind, a concussion is always a brain injury, but a brain injury is not always a concussion. And one thing that many people don't realize is that you can have a TBI or a brain injury from an indirect injury as well from the brain bouncing around or shaking or twisting in the skull in some manner. A forceful injury can result in a wide variety of symptoms that may affect how a person thinks, learns, feels, acts, and even sleeps. Chemical changes in the brain occur, and there's stretching and damaging to the brain cells. There is a range of symptoms that can occur, but no definitive ones for mild or moderate. Severe can include things like lower cognitive functioning, physical disability, and functional skill loss.
So this is a great graphic of some of the symptoms that an individual may have to live with after a head injury. It is not all encompassing, but it does represent some of the most common symptoms. So let's say you have headaches and you have sensitivity to light, you have memory problems, and you have physical outbursts. Or you're easily fatigued, you have difficulty finding words with big mood swings, and you cannot sleep at all. Or let's say you have in the beginning dizziness, blurred and double vision with feelings of not feeling very great about yourself and impulsive behavior. But then in 3 months, you may have neck pain, memory problems, easily agitated, getting lost. There can be cascading symptoms after you suffer a brain injury. So the symptoms may not actually stay the same. And that is something a lot of people don't realize or understand as well. And then if you take a child with special needs who are more likely to suffer a mild or moderate TBI and add on all of these physical, cognitive, emotional symptoms on top of what the behaviors they may already have, that can really amp up kind of what's happening with the kiddo. And if they're nonverbal and not able to express what's happening, that can make it even worse.
So, causes most prevalent in children are falls, sports-related injuries, and motor vehicle accidents. Some of the other causes that we're seeing in emerging data in Alaska are from ATV accidents in kids that are 10 to 19-year-old range, and unfortunately, domestic violence incidents in birth to 9-year-old range. Because the brain is still not really understood, the duration of effects for a person with a brain injury could be short or long term. So acute versus chronic, there's post-concussive syndrome. So if you look, 70% to 80% of head injuries will recover in a couple weeks to a couple months. Unfortunately, that leaves the other 20 to 30% of people with long-term lifelong issues, often past that 3-month mark. And those can be severe and unfortunately debilitating in some instances.
So most students and even adults who suffer brain injuries will struggle with a combination of the effects. So they can become really tired easily, or they may be exhausted all of the time. They may have frequent or daily headaches. They may have sensory issues from light and sound. They could actually sleep too much or sleep too little. And then we have the cognitive effects, which can be that forgetfulness. They can, all of a sudden be completely unorganized, distracted. Sometimes they'll have speech issues. So they'll lose their words, they'll stutter. And then emotional, we have transition difficulties. We have the flat affect, depression, crying, laughing. And that surprises people because they're like, well, why are they laughing? And a lot of times if you ask, they have no idea why. And then behavioral, complete dysregulation, complete personality changes can happen. And then there's the irritability, the sadness, the physical or the verbal outbursts. So there's lots of different effects that can happen on learning and living. This is Dr. Jane Gillette. She's a neurologist and this is a video from Brainline on the common problems a child may have after a brain injury.
Well, some of the most common problems of a child after a brain injury vary tremendously. If it's a mild brain injury or a concussion, then the child may complain of being dizzy and losing their balance. They can complain of fatigue. They'll complain of possibly of headache. Often they'll have a sleep disturbance. They don't process information as quickly, so they fall a little bit behind in school. They might not find their words quite as easily. They're more irritable. They cry or laugh more quickly. Most kids with a mild brain injury and concussion, most, will recover from it fairly well and look pretty good, and will do really quite well. But there is a percentage of kids with mild brain injuries that will continue to have ongoing problems at school and have ongoing problems with their, with headaches and stuff. So you have to be able to follow the children with a mild brain injury to make sure that you're not missing the one that's not going to do well. But then you get into the more moderate to severe brain injuries. And most kids will recover without any sort of obvious physical disability. Now, sure, there's going to be those who've been severely injured, affected the motor strip of the brain, and will be left with weakness or down one side, or like we call a hemiparesis, may even end up being in a wheelchair and needing to be cared for. But most children will end up being able to be mobile, walking and running, and their biggest problems are left with their cognitive issues. And the cognitive issues can include, again, being slower to process information, not being able to pay attention, being easily distracted, lacking initiation. Even though they want to do well, they just can't get themselves organized to get going, having organizational problems. There are all these things we call frontal lobe or executive functions, because the frontal lobes are the areas of the brain that are most frequently damaged. They can also have problems with their memory. They'll have problems with emotional regulation. They may or may not recognize other people. And then, of course, because a brain injury can affect almost any part of your brain, you might have visual motor problems, so you have trouble writing, visual perceptual problems, so you can't find things in space. You may not be able to see objects in your peripheral field. You may end up with pituitary dysfunction and not be able to have the normal growth hormones and other hormones for proper growth. You can end up with hearing problems. You can end up with tinnitus or ringing in your ears. You can end up not understanding what's being said to you, having trouble finding your words, and not have what we call cognitive communication skills, which is where you can read the person's body language and emotions and recognize that someone is asking you a question even though they haven't phrased it in a question form, all those kinds of things. So it can affect almost any area of the brain.
So when we look at students and returning to school or play, there are some recommended steps. So step one, total rest. So that's no exertion whatsoever. That includes being on your phone, and especially for young children these days with devices everywhere, that is a very hard one for kids to want to give up, and one that you will probably have to monitor to make sure that it occurs. Then we move on to kind of light mental activity. That's about 30 minutes of exertion throughout the day. You're going to kind of progress up, and when you're able to handle those 30 minutes without worsening symptoms is when you move on to kind of part-time school. That's when you're coming back with accommodations that might be shortened days or schedules, breaks that are built into your day, quiet places, no significant testing or stress. Modify rather than postpone academic things, so things aren't piling up and the kids are not feeling stressed. Extra time, help, modified assignments, those are all things that can help in that. So when a concussion occurs, a child often looks normal, and one of the issues is teachers might be unaware of the student's cognitive difficulties during that recovery. So rest is needed. for the brain to recover from a concussion. It's plain and simple. Taxing the brain with things such as heavy academic activity can impede or prolong a recovery for a student. Most students will recover fully in days or weeks, but just like anything, every case is unique and different, and some students will take longer to heal. As we've kind of mentioned, full recovery, if it's not evident in 3 months, we suggest looking at a 504 or an IEP. Those might be helpful to meet any specific learning challenges that the student's facing. Not all students will need academic accommodations or modifications following a concussion. So again, consult with each student's healthcare provider. Let them help guide you through this process to recovery. All steps in an academics protocol need to be completed without significant increase in symptoms before a student, or especially a student athlete, is ready to proceed or return to play protocol. And having a healthcare provider in conjunction working with a school nurse is imperative in these situations. So as we kind of return to school, the kids are back in part-time school. There's some of those moderate accommodations that are maybe happening, and we're at about an hour worth of academics at this point where we're handling that and symptoms are not worsening. Step 5, finally back to full-time school. Hopefully those accommodations are minimal at that point, and to kind of progress to the next step, they need to be able to handle all of their class periods in succession without having, again, worsening symptoms. And that is the key, is the worsening symptoms, and medical clearance by a physician to return to full academics or in conjunction with a nurse at the school level. And finally, returning back to full-time academics with no restrictions whatsoever. Again, it's imperative to remember progress is individual in each and every case. A student can also start at any step, and as symptoms dictate, they can remain at a step as long as needed. They may even return to a previous step if symptoms worsen. So this is not a simple, it's always going to go step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You might go 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oops, we're back to 3. So do know that this is a very much a sliding scale and does not always go in a very linear fashion. Also, no return to play protocol should be implemented until after a student has returned to full academics. So here we have the intervention to SPED. So this is kind of a guide for some school-wide accommodation protocols for students with concussions, and can be implemented pretty effectively in most schools. So Tier 1, the majority of students with a concussion will respond positively to a well-orchestrated system of cognitive reduction, physical rest, simple classroom adjustments to the existing classroom curriculum, and slight environmental changes to support physical and cognitive rest. At Tier 1, the concussion management team can collect data on symptoms to monitor progress and make modifications as needed. And again, that's 80 to 90% of students. When you get to Tier 2, that's 10 to 20% of the students who experience symptoms beyond that typical 3 to 4 week recovery period and can be systematically moved to Tier 2 for targeted intervention. So at Tier 2, a more formalized academic plan might be required for the student. So you're looking at maybe a health plan, an RTI, maybe a 504 plan. The objective of a Tier 2 is to expand and strengthen those academic modification or accommodations to affect greater recovery from the concussion. And then you have that 1 to 5% of people that fall into Tier 3. Those are the students who do not adequately respond to concussion management efforts in Tiers 1 and 2 and experience severe long-term neurocognitive and physical effects for weeks or months. Students who don't benefit from management attempts in tier 1 or tier 2 would be advanced to the most intensive level of assessment and intervention provided at tier 3. And at this level, modification of curriculum and protection under IDEA and including an IEP might be necessary for the child. Should symptoms continue beyond the 3 to 4 weeks, prolonged in school support should be required. At that point, request a meeting to plan and coordinate for the future. So that's where accommodations modifications, 504s are a short-term plan for a student, or an IEP can even be done for a long-term plan if needed. So some of the accommodations and modifications that you might see in one of these plans: frequent breaks, sunglasses, shortened assignments, notes or outlines of lectures, preferential seating, even maybe an audio recording of a lecture to play back and listen to later. These are all things that can be requested through a 504 or an IEP if needed.
So when you're looking at accommodations for a 504, an IEP, or a temporary plan, the biggest thing you want to provide is repetition and consistency. So this needs to apply to lessons, directions, and work. So you need to demonstrate new tasks step by step and give examples as needed to clarify ideas and concepts. A lot of times, if you give a visual example of products, so the brain doesn't have to work so hard to visualize, they can do better. Use plain, simple language, be direct and literal with all your expectations, directions, and examples. Don't use slang or idioms. Reinforce lengthening periods of attention to appropriate tasks. So set up an incremental amount of time on assignment or a lesson and the attention needed to complete that. And then for the next one, lengthen it just a little, and the next one, lengthen it just a little. You're going to need to constantly be doing skill acquisition assessments to check in kind of where they're at, what they're doing, how they're feeling, and make sure to, demonstrate everything that you're doing so they understand, and even maybe get them to tell you what they think you said to make sure that they understand what you said. So some big things to do for modification is to model those strategies for increasing that memory. This could be mnemonic, making a poem, a rap, a rhyme, a visual schedule, structure in time and objects, set timers up. One of the big things that we just look for kiddos, especially in teens, is they're already exhausted all the time anyway. So it might be hard to see when there's more exhaustion. So just look out for that. Remove as many distractions as possible. And if there are routines, help rehearse them.
When it comes to support strategies, it's important to ask what they need and how they feel, and be attentive to those needs throughout the process. Look at those environmental triggers, be aware of your surroundings, be aware of where you are. If you are planning an outing, think ahead, what could some of those environmental triggers be in that outing, and is that a good place for us to be? Offer those frequent brain breaks, take time away from environment is golden. That can be a major key to helping that brain rest a little bit. Always have a backup plan on kind of how to slip away from a situation if you can as well, in the event that you need that break and you just have to leave. Allow the blue light or sunglasses. These are things that can easily be purchased these days through the internet. Blue blocker glasses can even be found on Amazon. Some you can't even tell there's anything different about them from a regular pair of glasses that a student would wear for everyday use. So it's not like this is something that has to make a kid look different than their peers. It is very functional and very easy. They can blend in just like everyone else. And allow those noise canceling headphones if needed. I am personally a fan of Walker's headphones. They now have earbuds. They offer a variety of different uses, from noise blocking to allowing in a little bit of noise. They have lots of different functions built into some of their headphones. So make sure that is something that you have access to.
When it comes to therapies for brain injuries, whether moderate, mild, or severe, they have found in the research that an interdisciplinary approach gives the best outcomes when you're doing rehab. So some possible therapies that you could get depending on your needs. You could get occupational therapy if you're having a hard time moving around in space. You could get speech therapy if your speech center is affected and you're having like losing words, you are stuttering, if your written communication is all of a sudden taking a dive. Chiropractic care, especially if you were like in an accident or where your head whiplashed, that can be very helpful. Osteopathic manipulation is similar to chiropractic care, except it works on the muscles and the fascia and releasing the tension, stress, and trauma to those areas. And then we have physical therapy. And one of the things that when we talk about physical therapy, there's actually specific kinds of physical therapy that are really good for people with mild and moderate concussions. And it is called vestibular therapy, which is one. And that is your inner ear system, your balance system, and then your visual function. There's visual therapy as well that it kind of slots under physical therapy. But a lot of time, especially if you hit the back of your head, you can have visual problems. Music therapy can be really helpful. I read a story about a woman who could not talk unless she was singing. That's just how her brain was damaged. Counseling is very important because you're dealing with a lot of stuff all at once. Even if you just need it for a little while, it's really, really important. And then medications. You could have everything from typical prescriptions to nutraceuticals. Like riboflavin, which is a B vitamin, is supposed to be really, really good for brain injury, development, regrowth, all of that kind of stuff. So everything from, those regular normal prescriptions you might get from a doctor to nutraceuticals like that. There are also new and emerging therapies. So since 2016 or so, things started to advance at a more rapid pace when it comes to brain injury research. And then we had COVID, and now we have all of these survivors with long COVID, which is being classified as an acquired brain injury. And it looks a lot like what happens after a traumatic brain injury. And so there's new research happening, there's new medications coming out, and there's new therapies coming out. One of them is microcurrent neurofeedback, and another is those hyperbaric chamber treatments. So there's more to come on those, but those are some of the emerging therapies that are showing some helpful properties. In this presentation, we've talked about those 20 to 30% of kids and adults who don't recover fully. I am one of that minority. 6 years ago, in fact, just a few days, I will have my 6-year anniversary. I took a fall on black ice, and it was basically the cartoon character who flew up into the air and slammed back down on the ground, hitting the back of my head. So it took me almost 2 years of treatment and therapies to get back to a functional level, including my balance, vision, cognitive, and chemical. One thing to keep in mind is that I am not better or like I was before. I'm only able to function at a productive level. I have lots of mitigation strategies in place now in order to get me through a day. I had to change careers. I was in engineering. And so I came back to my first love in social sciences because it's very much easier on a cognitive and visual level. My visual system did get hurt. My eyes took a dive. My autonomic nervous system also got hurt. So now I have a heart condition. So lots of different things can happen depending on where you hit your head. I also did have a change in personality. I was much more of an extrovert, and now I'm very much an introvert. I experienced weird symptoms like waking up with music in my head, and I have a really bad body temperature imbalance. It used to be completely cold all the time. And then after my head injury, the lower half of my body is cold all the time, and the upper half of my body is so hot that I literally can pour sweat sometimes. I did have to go to frequent doctor visits and experiment with medications. Up until 6 months ago in September, I woke up every day with a headache, and I had to figure out where I was pain-wise and plan what I was going to do for mitigation that day. And then in September, thankfully, my doctor found an old medication that had some off-label uses, and he's like, okay, let's try it and see what happens. And I am very weird, and we already knew that. And it cleared about 80% of the brain fog and the mental exhaustion that I was living with, and even some of the headache. So it was an amazing turnaround. I still do live with daily symptoms. I have chronic pain and exhaustion, so I need a lot of frequent breaks, and I have a whole raft of medications to keep me stable. I do have extreme migraine clusters, especially in the fall and the spring when the light changes. I do have the vision changes in the eyes. Unfortunately, I still live with light sensitivity. I used to be a total sun worshiper, and that's no longer possible. I do have memory issues. You'll hear my verbal speech get poor, especially if I'm tired. I'll start stuttering and not being able to find words. And then time slippage for me is even more extreme than most people who have just gone through COVID. So lots of different things can happen. It's not just the typical symptoms. And some of these things came months after my head injury and then resolved all by themselves months later. And then I'd get a new raft of symptoms, or I'd get one and one would go away. So it's very, very different when you have a brain injury.
Stages of grief, this is a big deal. This is a lot to deal with. And whether you are the patient or you are the caregiver, grief is a serious process when a brain injury is involved. So just like a return to school plan, grief doesn't always follow that straight path either. It can be all over the place. There can be good days and bad days, both with the patient and as a caregiver if you are helping. There's struggles with learning to walk through life and deal with your new reality and existence. Please be patient and kind with everyone involved in this process, even yourself, if you are part of this process. This is not going to be easy, but there are ways to overcome eventually.
So some really important caregiver information is to be patient with yourself and the survivor. And if you are the survivor, really, really be patient with yourself. Realize that personality changes, like the irritability, going from extrovert to introvert, all completely normal with a brain injury. Having information or tasks or directions presented to the survivor in more than one way or more modalities. So having it through auditory and visual, or visual and touch. The more modalities you can present information, the better it will be remembered. Make sure you get or find comprehensive information about what you're going through. Sometimes you can get that from your doctor, but a lot of doctors in the US do not have the most up-to-date information. There was kind of a ball dropped in 2016. And so if you're looking for good information, look to Canada. Be aware of the safety issues when you have a traumatic brain injury, because once you've had one, you're at a much higher risk of getting more. And those can compound symptoms from the first one or the second one or the third one. And make sure, no matter what, that you take care of yourself, whether you're the survivor or the caregiver, the family member, the friend. Network with others and make sure that you have a support system as well. So we're going to spend our last bit of time on a new resource that has recently come to Alaska. So this is called returntoschool.org, and we're going to go into the website so that you can see it. When you come to the website for the first time, you click up here and it'll show you the different states. This is a consortium between Alaska, Oregon, and Washington right now. And it is hosted by the University of Oregon's Center for Brain Injury Research and Training. So you just go up here and you push Alaska. So the really cool thing about this website is that under Learn, it has videos, webinars, and trainings on brain injury. And the really cool thing that I love is the tools. So it actually has tools for administrators, like principals and job managers. It has tools for educators. It has tools for parent and caregivers, the research, some infographics, and great stuff as well. One of the things that I find is really, really cool, especially if it's a kiddo who's going through this, is so they may not have like the severe level, and maybe they just need some temporary accommodations. This right here is the temporary school accommodations plan. And the nice thing about it is it actually outlines, like you can ask the kiddo, what symptoms are you having, and then you can adjust the accommodations specifically for those. So you circle all of the things that are happening, and then you go down here and you can look at the requested accommodation for the different areas. So this is one of the great things that we have now in Alaska. Another thing that is really cool is under the parents. So they have like academic accommodations to minimize the frustration, because frustration, it's really strange. It's like when you get a concussion, your ability to handle frustration drops to zero. You have no patience. You have no ability to handle disruptions. It's really, really hard. Talking about friendship and peer acceptance and how brain injury is different from other disabilities. And one of those things is that it is an invisible disability. So people may not realize what is happening with you, and they may treat you in such a way that really isn't actually a result of what actually happened to you. There's a symptom checklist. There's what teachers should know, and then signs and symptoms. So there's a lot of fun stuff there as well. Then there's cool infographics. So some common school supports that would be really, really nice for the kiddo. You can literally just hand these to the teachers so they understand what's happening and know how to work with your kiddo.
I just want to say thank you to all of you for joining us today. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Anna. You can find our emails listed on the last slide, along with a couple of pages of resources that are extremely helpful. If you have any further questions, there are places that you can quickly find yourself going down the rabbit hole of looking for information.